Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast on Matt's Musings. It's been a long time since we've actually recorded anything here because I've been waiting for the perfect guest. So today I have Lachlan. He works at ANU as a PhD student. Being a PhD student is a job. Let's not forget that. You're not just adding value, you're also having to deal with all the beautiful university things. He also works at E61 as a research manager alongside myself, where he constantly fact checks me and helps me not go off the rails. So that's really great. So welcome, Lachlan.
Thanks, Matt. Long time reader, first time caller, so excited to be here.
Excellent. Excellent. So, it would be great to just sit here and have a chat about life and things and, how we're going to work on formatting documents at E61. But I was thinking maybe it would be fun to chat about your recent newsletter, the one we worked on about, is it Wyala?
Yeah, the Whyalla Wipeout newsletter. You joke about formatting documents, but one of the skills I picked up working in the public service is a love for formatting and grammar in documents. But yeah, for those who don't know much about Whyalla or haven't seen the Whyalla Wipeout clip, I've had to educate Matt on that as a Kiwi. It's a bit of a seminal piece of political folklore here. But it was also your newsletter, Matt, so I don't want to take all the credit.
True, true.
So, do you want me to give a bit of an intro to why Whyalla, why we're interested?
I would love that context.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Whyalla is this relatively small town, about 4 hours north of Adelaide or northwest, and mainly a steelworks town. It's the major employer in the town. And I think it was 2 weeks ago now, or 3 weeks ago now, the government announced that the steelworks there had fallen into administration, or they put it into administration, and they were going to not bail it out, give it a rescue package of around $2.4 billion. And so, $2.4 billion is quite a bit of money. And so the kind of motivation for the newsletter was why is the government doing this? And is it the best use of the money?
Nice. Now, a similar thing has happened repeatedly in New Zealand. This place called the TY Smelter down in Southland. The key thing with these types of bailouts is often you see a lot of people going to lose their job, and it looks quite expensive to bail them out, but you're sort of unsure what's going to happen to them in their community when that occurs. How would you think about that set of problems when you observe such a shock and you're thinking about how a government should intervene?
Yeah, good question. So there's a couple of things as an economist I'd be thinking about. Noting that economics isn't everything in life. I think we,
Wait,
we probably think that.
wait, what's happened here? Uh,
Yeah, we'll edit that out later. Uh, but as an economist, there's a couple of things you'd want to be thinking about. And the first is, I think it's obvious to people, but job loss is costly. And so you can think about the economic and the maybe less economic impacts of job loss. The other thing economists may be thinking about here is if you have a concentrated employer in the one area and that area is not close to other employment opportunities, could there be these like negative spillover or downstream effects? And so they're the kind of two main things that kind of jumped out to us when we were thinking about this. And another thing that I think people sometimes think about with the cost of job loss is the JobKeeper subsidy that came through in the pandemic. Don't want to plug some other work that you and I have done here, Matt, but I think it's important to just to kind of distinguish between the reason why the government intervened here versus the reason why the government intervened back in COVID, and why those two things were different. So in COVID, the government intervened with JobKeeper, which I should know the number of how much they spent, but I can't remember. It was 90 something billion. And the idea there was that they were intervening for three main reasons, to support businesses with cash flow or liquidity problems. But the main one that they called out was kind of preserving these employment matches between workers and firms, and preserving what they saw was the quality of the match and the intangible capital that came with the match. I think it's important to be clear here. That's not really what the government's trying to do. What the government's trying to do in this situation in Whyalla is helping people ameliorate the cost of job loss and the potential downstream effects of that.
I think that's very true. And a framework I quite enjoy for this is to jump exactly where you've gone with match value and then step back to wages. So if we think about the wage that you are paid when you go to your job, that represents the set of skills and attributes you have to do that job. It represents the type of firm you're at. It might be a firm that's really risk-taking and is more productive as a result and passes some of that on, but you have to bear some risk. And it might be the fact that you and that job get along. You go in, your boss does handshakes the way you like to do handshakes. You just edit documents the same way. You go and you build pieces of cars effectively together. And that match value then leads to something special happening in that job. So when we view a wage, we can see it split into these three components. Your human capital as an individual, this firm value associated with the qualities of the firm, where it's earning a rent or whether it provides safety for you and then pays you less. And then finally, this idea that there's specific match value because of the unique way that you and that job combine together. Now, when we talk about job loss being costly here, a lot of that is talking about the idea that wages will fall on job loss. Do you have any idea which of these types of characteristics, which of these elements tends to be the large driver of what happens when there's a big mass layoff, such as what would have happened here?
Yeah, another good question. I think this is one where we'd say more evidence is needed in Australia at least. So some research institute that's interested in economics and uses data should spend some time looking at this. But I think the international evidence, which we can look at here to kind of guide us, suggests that it's like the third channel, I think, of what you mentioned. The firm effect explains a relatively large proportion of the observed wage losses. Um, but specific to Australia, I think it's an open question. In our work on the decarbonisation at the coalface, we looked at workers who were made redundant from coal-fired power plants and some of the factors that made them more or less likely to have longer wage scars or income loss from job loss. You see some characteristics like age and occupation really matter, but that's kind of indicative and doesn't really tell us a concrete answer that we're after here. So I think it's the OECD research that looks at a few different countries, highlights the role of the firm, and yeah, it kind of suggests to us that maybe the traditional focus on increasing unemployment benefits or things like that may not be the silver bullet we often think it might be in these situations.
Now that's exactly right. And alongside those, you've got the is it 2021 Lachuaska paper that finds that firm effects are quite dominant. You've got the earlier Woodcock work where he integrates match effects that find firm's effects are still really important, even if they're ameliorated by that. So there's this sort of large international finding that matters. Now, when we look at a firm effect, this is telling us that there's something unique about the firm and how that passes through. Now, I touched through some ideas about how that can function. It can be the idea that the firm's willing to take on risk and you're being remunerated to bear that risk. So you've got some big startup firm that's all flashy and their revenue's flying everywhere and they're all set to fail. Now, if we have a scar that occurs because of that, because in the end that firm did fail, would we really want to intervene about that? Well, probably not. But if the scar is instead due to we have a situation where the firm is actually sitting there and unemployed workers are joining a new firm that just goes and sneaks in and takes unemployed workers, thinks that they're a good bargain bin, inverted commas. I don't want to be rude about unemployed people because they're valuable and worthwhile in of themselves. But the firm might sit there and say, I can bring in this type of worker, I can bring them in cheap. The worker lacks bargaining power. Both of the types of things I've talked about here would show up in a firm effect. And at the moment, there isn't much research trying to separate them, trying to understand is it that a firm is picking a whole pool of unemployed workers, or is it because that firm is risky? And this is something at E61 we have the data to tease this out, and we want to dig into this a bit more. We think it's a really cool question. But when we're looking at Whyalla, we've got a situation where there is this firm effect that's likely here that might not be either of these things. So let me be very specific about what the firm effect is. We're saying a situation where wages are higher for all workers in that firm due to them being at that firm. It's not some of the workers. On average, these workers are receiving a higher wage. Now, what happens if Whyalla is just in a situation where it has market power, it has a situation, it's known as being risky because it's in this small town, it's known that the government will bail it out. In that case, surpluses from that will be passed on to workers, and any scarring we observe from that is coming from this. This doesn't tell us that that scarring is something that would be avoidable unless we subsidize these workers permanently. And there's a question about whether that's fair. So, my big long rant, this hasn't really been a question, but it's really a
Mm.
point that when we think about this firm effect, understanding what it is really expresses to us whether this is important and in what way it's important. These workers know that they would be supported by government, and therefore we feel an obligation as a society to support them. But what about the person that loses their job in Sydney and they have to go onto the unemployment benefit with a replacement rate around 28%? They're not receiving an $800,000 payout to keep their job. So we have to think about the equivalence of that. Now, I put quite a specific line in the sand there, Lachlan. Do you
Mm.
think that's a fair characterization, or do you think I'm being a little bit of a market ideologue?
Yeah. So one of the things we got a lot of, I don't know what the term is, engagement is the term people use, I think, on the decarbonisation work around was, we're looking at people who worked at coal-fired power plants, which are kind of seen as a long declining industry, but previously really well paying. And a lot of the people said to us when we kind of teased out some of this firm effect as and highlighted it as playing a role in the wage scar or the income loss was, well, why do we care? These people could have been being paid a higher rent, which is kind of what you were talking about here, because of the industry or specific skills they had within that industry. And the only way to ameliorate that job scar or that income loss in the future is to continually pay them a subsidy. And I think one of the lines we got from one government department was, why should we care about people who've been spending all their money on jet skis who now, unfortunately, because of the changing economy, no longer have that opportunity? It's a tough question. As an economist, I have an easy answer in that I like to look at problems, look at their efficiency, and then look at their trade-offs. I'm not going to tell anyone what our preference as a society should be about how we redistribute or support people. But you could think about it in terms of the way you've framed it, in terms of how we encourage worker mobility, encourage worker, uh, I suppose, like job search or job to job mobility, rather than just looking at does someone deserve A or does the other person deserve B. One other reason which I didn't flag at the start of why government might want to intervene, and the reason why I didn't flag it is because I think it's too frequently used and improperly used, is this idea of economic resilience or national security. So some people put forward, and I think the government post-release decided to call it Future Made in Australia. Some people have put forward the argument that actually, this steelworks is really important for our national security and economic resilience. We need to be able to make long steel in Australia so we can use it in things that use long steel, which I'm not really aware of. I assume
Hmm.
it's important manufactured goods. What do you think about that?
So I think that's a really fascinating point. As an economist, I start with a prior where I'm like, we've got a global supply chain, we can just specialize. But I've also seen what's happening in the United States. I've seen the Chinese warship activities off the coast of Sydney threatening planes to my dear homeland of New Zealand. I
Just to
recognize
really
that
get the
there is potential supply chain externalities associated with uncertainty of the supply chain, where we think that those risks aren't going to be fully captured by private industry, and there is a national security risk. And I can accept that as an answer if we're going to treat all types of steelworks and all types of ideas in that way consistently. But when it's an ad hoc thing, an ex post justification, I mean, I become suspicious because I've worked in policy circles a long time. I've seen ministers ex post justify things for all sorts of reasons. And if that argument's going to hold, I want to see it applied consistently all over the place. And if we do that, we'll start finding that there's a limited budget envelope and there's hard decisions to make. So, how about we have those conversations clearly rather than just ad hoc supporting things where we think there's a few votes?
thinking. So my next question's harder. It's always a hard one for an economist, particularly a researcher. So we've said this is a silly idea. It's not the best use of 2.2 billion. Might sound like an easy claim. So we calculate it's about $800,000 per direct or indirect worker affected. So it's a lot of money. How would you better spend that $800,000?
So I'll start with the idea of I've got $800,000 per person. So I can be just completely lazy and I could give each of those individuals $800,000 And I think that they would say they're better off in that situation where they lose their job and have $800,000 than if they kept their job because they'll be able to move anywhere and do whatever they want. So in that situation, there is going to be something better. We already know that we can do a policy that leads to these people transitioning and being happier for the same expenditure. So let's think about what those things are. In other work that we've done at E61, we looked at wage scarring from the global financial crisis. So we've done a series of different wage scarring investigations to try to build a full picture. And with this, we were very interested in the idea of what happened in terms of the trajectories of workers based on whether they found reemployment and if they did, how persistent it was. And what we found is people that took a while to find permanent reemployment, up to 5 years, they still ended up with their wage scarring evaporating and them ending up on the same path we would have expected them to be on if they hadn't lost their job due to a mass layoff in the global financial crisis. Furthermore, if they found a job relatively quickly, the scar closed very quickly and they were back to the same wage trajectory. In the end, wage scarring in Australia appears to be driven by the fact that when someone loses their job, they're more likely to exit the labour market again later. They're more likely to be in insecure work and unable to retain a position in the same way they did previously. Now, I think that's a really important insight. If we can make sure that these workers that experience a loss of a job are able to potentially relocate, move to a position where they can find stable work, where they can utilize skills and their skills are matched to that job, they're going to end up in a situation where they're just as well off. And we should be able to support people making those transitions at a much lower cost than $800,000 per person. As a result, thinking particularly about how we would design, I don't know why that's a hard word for me, I blame my Kiwi accent, how we would design such a scheme, how such an active labour market policy would work to help people in that transition. There's a lot of international work on designing that, a lot of international work on thinking about it. And the more we have these types of transitions, the more useful that can be. Doing that thinking now can save us that money in the future when we're thinking about these types of firms failing.
Yeah, as a good policymaker that you are, if I go back to the kind of drivers that you were talking about before, one of those you were talking about people who kind of didn't have bargaining power, and I kind of think about that because there's an information asymmetry or something occurring in
Mm.
that situation. So it sounds like what you're proposing here or talking about is helping decrease that information asymmetry or helping overcome the friction about them finding a potential job that's long lasting or that works well for them.
No, that's very true. I think that's a really important insight is you had me banging on about this idea of, oh, let's just find a job search service where we get someone back into a job. And then we'll say something about the quality of the match depending on their wage a year or two later. But if we're not getting into a situation where firms can see how good that worker is,
Mm.
then we're going to have a situation where firms will demand a discount on that worker. And even once they realize how good that person is, they've come in on a lower wage and they end up penalized. So, in a lot of ways, it's about making sure employers and employees can work together. Now, this worries me because I can see a lot of ways that such schemes could be abused or just treated in a farcical way. This will need to be evidence based. I see that Andrew Lee and Dewar are doing a lot of work using randomized control trials to understand what interventions work. And I think this just highlights how important that understanding those interventions are for really making sure that we have effective interventions after such a mass layoff and that we don't just throw money at factories to try to ignore the problem and throw it further down the road.
Mm. I think the other thing that was missing from the conversation, also missing from our newsletter, so this is a self-critique, as any good economist does.
Hmm.
The other thing that's kind of missing in the conversation is obviously there's been a range of work on scarring and graduates into the labor market in the global financial crisis, and there's a Treasury working paper on this from I think 2020. And obviously, the state of the labor market obviously makes a big difference in your ability to find re-employment and the quality of that employment. And at the moment, from all reports, we have a very strong, tight labor market, which is probably the time where you're okay with allowing people or encouraging people to transition. versus if we had elevated unemployment in the 7% or the 8% like we did during COVID, you might be more concerned about that ability to re-enter the workforce within the 1 year or 5 years as your work shows, which really ameliorates that wage scar.
That's true. Teasing that out though, what would we observe as the failure there? If we have a situation where unemployment is 7 or 8%, all right?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a macroeconomic failure, not a
Yeah.
wireless failure.
I would be looking at our dear close friends at the RBA, and definitely not pointing at my wife, but I potentially might be, and saying, why are you letting unemployment be so high?
One last question related to YLR. So what do we say? So we've got, the Whyalla Steelworks closing down. It employs, I think, 3,100 people in a town of 22,000. I think of that 22,000, almost half not in the labor force, or just under half. What do as economists, we're saying we should give these people 800 grand. They can go do whatever they want, buy a caravan, drive around Australia, maybe even visit New Zealand if they have to. And so what do you say to the people who already live in Whyalla without a job, who might be affected in terms of their amenity value of the town and things like that? How do we think about that problem?
No, I think that's an important issue to think about. When I look at the shutdown of a lot of the meatworks and related factories in the late 80s in New Zealand, you see these persistent scars in communities where people grew up there, and then after the loss of job and the loss of that major factory, everything became very desperate. And, a lot of great bands actually came out of those situations in New Zealand. When you sit in Wellington, you would often hear a lot of bands playing that came from the Kapiti Coast or came from Wairarapa who had experienced that. And the thing is, we'd lost sight of the fact that that community, due to technological change and due to the loss of these factories, that community had lost value and they needed the opportunity and ability to transition as well. Now, it's a really fraught moral issue when you have people that just want to stay. They have an affinity, a relationship with that area, and they don't want to leave. But we're really going to say that we should be spending $2.2 million per active worker or $800,000 per worker that we see affected just so that people can say, I don't want to move? In reality, society has always had people have to move and have to go from places that are dying, which in this case, these communities are dying, to areas that are expanding. And being too nostalgic and forgetting that we need people to move as letting our emotions get on top of us. We have to be making sure that people have these opportunities and the ability to move through, but we can't just completely shut down an entire society and take a whole lot of taxpayer money to make a small community feel a bit better about itself.
I think the other thing, which kind of goes to your point about how you think about AI and future jobs, is we don't know what, if you give everyone $800,000, we don't know what might spring up in its place. Like, people might take the money and go somewhere else, or they might come set up their own businesses in Whyalla or surrounding areas in like Port Augusta and places like that. And so we don't really know what actually the future of the community looks like under the policy settings. And so it's harder to communicate to those people who are potentially affected in a spillover kind of sense what their community might look like anyway. So there could be a community still there, it just looks a bit different.
That's true.
So
And
not
I will
necessarily
note
going to close down.
I will note that my view likely sounds extreme even to other economists, because there are economists that will define why we should have place-based policies for these types of reasons. But I have a great fear of us just expecting people to stay in place and us reinforcing people staying in place. If there's a situation where there are great agglomeration benefits from moving, there are great opportunities from moving, and we're just keeping people in a place because that's how it's always been. I don't think we should be reinforcing history dependence. I think we should be trying to set up a situation where people can feel free to move. But it's a moral quandary because I can feel it in my heart. I'm from a small community that had a meatwork shut down, a mental health hospital shut down, and they were two of the big employers in that place at the time. And that was when benefit payments were being slashed. I saw the harm in the community. I saw it in my own family from what was happening there. But it's for that reason I'm just so uncomfortable with just throwing money at the problem and pretending it will go away instead of thinking about it carefully.
Yeah. Maybe it's me pitching potentially another podcast if you'll have me back. But it's interesting to think about the parallels or non-parallels with migration here, where a lot of people who are pro-migration internationally might also be anti-internal migration around these kind of issues. Noting my
Yeah.
bias as a son of Scottish migrants who very much happy with their decision to leave Scotland. So
Now that sounds like a lot of fun. Migration is definitely an area I have a lot to learn about, so would appreciate you schooling me. Thank you very much, Lachlan. And if anyone has any thoughts or feelings, definitely write them in the comments because comments are fun. Uh, and we'll see all of you later. Au revoir.
thanks, Matt.